Hello folks, this is Nick from Bootstrap Farmer, and this week we're going to have a special 4-part series on indeterminate tomatoes. Before I came onto Bootstrap, I grew tomatoes year-round in a 30 by 36 heated greenhouse, and I primarily grew cherry tomatoes in Dutch buckets. I also would grow seasonal tomatoes, both bush and indeterminate, in a 30 by 96 hoop house, and then a few specialty tomatoes in outdoor raised beds. And I've also seen tomato production from the trial farms at Johnny Selected Seeds all the way to the Southern California coast. So this week, the 4 videos, we're going to cover the following. In this video, we're going to identify and learn how to prune indeterminate tomatoes. In the next video, we're going to understand why we lower and lean tomatoes inside of a hoop house. The third video, we're going to talk about trellis setups inside of a hoop house for the lower and lean method. And in the 4th video, which is just under an hour, I'm going to rehab a couple of rows inside of an overgrown hoop house right here in Texas, in which we cover things like lower and leaning, heavy pruning, creating zones within the hoop house and on the vine, and learning how to save a plant whenever you have a miscut and when to decide where and when to cut a vine when needed. So we're going to drop one of these videos every day this week from Tuesday to Friday with accompanying graphs, pictures, and illustration, both on social media, and here in a couple of weeks, some extended blog articles at bootstrapfarmer.com. So let's get right into it and learn how to identify different parts of an indeterminate tomato plant and how to prune a single vine. All right, today we're going to talk about identifying the parts of your tomato plant. So if we're looking at the tomato plant from the main stem, what we have is right there is a little piece of a sucker coming out from an axil or the shoulder of the main stem and a leaf. So we'll pinch that off. This is an example of where the sucker is. We're training this to be the top part of the plant where we're trying to force production. And then this is a flower cluster, which then in turn, each flower is going to start tomato production. And so it's going to come progressively down the line. And so in another video, we'll talk about how to train your tomatoes to do full-on production instead of the whole cluster. Oftentimes, another leaf or another sucker will grow out of that cluster, and we can just pinch that off. So here's an example of a tomato cluster that's almost ready to be harvested. Here's a single tomato that'll be ready in a couple of days, and then these two should follow the next week. Now, here's an example of a tomato that's coming on, but because it's going to be so late in production and most likely harvested long after the rest of these are done, we're going to go ahead and pinch this off in order to force the production to focus on these two. So now we're going to talk about how to prune a tomato plant. So again, this is an indeterminate single leader plant in which we're going to harvest off a single vine going all the way to the top. So this particular row is pretty overgrown, and I need to start here in order to make a hole. So as we start leaning and lowering, which you'll see in another video, I kind of have room to work. So I like to start at the bottom because it's already been pruned a little bit, and I need to work on this airflow and then basically take all of this out of the way to where I just have the vine. This is going to make all of the tomato nutrients and water go up to the top, in which we're either harvesting the tomatoes or forming the next set of tomato clusters. So I'm going to start at the bottom, and I'm going to prune off the suckers, any old clusters that have already been harvested. And then if we're looking at it, last week this was pretty much the harvest zone. And so I'm going to go ahead and take off all those, and I'm also going to take off the leaves. Now the leaves is where the plant is basically breathing, and it may seem a little counterproductive, but again, we're trying to force that growth up to the tip. And those leaves at the tip are going to shade the tomato clusters on the next round of harvest. It may seem a little aggressive, but we are getting to this next round of tomato clusters. Now, if we lower and lean, there's several different ways to do it. My preferred method is, number one, whenever we need more line on a roller hook assembly, we're going to push that in and roll that out. This one's a little overgrown, so I'm not going to do it the way I would normally, which would be to pull it and slide it or just move it from here to there. So I really need to pull this down and really do some manipulation. And so I'm going to be really rough on this tomato just to show you how non-delicate they are. So basically I'm going to pull this out. I'm going to untwist this tomato both from the rafters and the trellis line. And you can see some stuff's falling off. I'm going to want the top of this vine about right here, about to the top of the next line. So I'm gonna have to pull it way out over here. I have enough string. I'm gonna set the cage back on the wire. And from here, I'm gonna pull the string along where I think I want this vine, which has several suckers, and where I want that single leader to form. So I'm gonna start clipping the tomato along that single ledger, along that single leader, all the way up to the top cluster. I'm gonna go just below the tip of the crown in which I'm trying to form this vine. Now from there, I have this guideline of the trellis string along the main leader, which then that helps me decide which suckers I'm gonna take off, which I'm gonna take off every sucker except for the main vine, including suckers that are emanating from a tomato cluster, including cutting off some of the flowers in order to make a cluster of 4 to 6, maybe 7, depending on what the variety is, in order to force all of that nutrient into a smaller amount of tomatoes. So a lot of people like to pinch, that's completely fine, but on some of the bigger clusters, I do like to cut. And I'll go ahead and cut the leaf and this cluster too. And a lot of folks might say, well, you're also cutting off a lot of tomatoes. That's true. Again, I want better consistency in the tomato clusters I plan on harvesting versus trying to get every single little tomato out of the whole thing. And so then I'll just go down and I'll cut. Every now and then, I do personally like to take off the leaf clusters that are going to face down initially. And if I look back on the activity and I think, well, maybe I probably pruned too much, that's really going to be okay. The other thing I'm looking for, and I don't see any here, but I'm looking for brown leaves or any kind of spots that all the health of the tomato plant isn't fully getting to the leaf. So I'm looking at this now. My initial cutting looks pretty good. I'm going to leave that, and I'm just giving myself permission to come back to it later on. Now, what I'm going to do on this particular run is every other tomato I'm going to lean left, and every other tomato on the other side I'm going to lean right. And you're going to see an example of that later on. Well, I hope you liked that first video, and I hope by now you've picked up that however you are deciding to do your tomato plants, there's a lot of room for error, and they are not only going to be one of your top money performers, but they're also a very forgiving crop. In the next video, we will talk about why we lean and lower indeterminate tomatoes inside of a hoop house.